welcome you to the auditorium class this Sunday morning. And also welcome those that are live streaming. We have a wonderful snow outside. This may be the last opportunity you have this year, that this season, to enjoy this wonderful snow. Just beautiful this morning. All the way in from the house, I tried to convince Betty that this is really nice, this is great, and she wasn't buying a bit of it. I repeated that several times, and she, for some reason, didn't appreciate even me thinking that it was nice. So we're in the third chapter of Daniel chapter 3. Remember, chapter 2 was an interesting chapter about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had regarding the interpretation thereof, those four kingdoms. And he was the head of gold. His kingdom was the head of gold, which meant that his kingdom was far superior to the other kingdoms that would follow. That is the Medo-Persian kingdom, the Grecian, and the Romans. Now, he acknowledged the might of God, the greatness of God. Some people think he was converted to Judaism, but that he became a believer. There's a difference between being really a believer and acknowledging, God. And so this chapter probably followed this narrative in chapter 3, probably followed a couple years after his interpretation, that the interpretation that Daniel gave him with regard to his dream, that he couldn't even remember the content of the dream. So he here, maybe it's a couple of years later, he gets this great image. He puts together a great image. Now, some folks believe that image, and by the way, that was a big image, 90 feet high, 9 feet across. You wonder how that was constructed, and with the whatever technology they had, whatever building expertise they had. It's just a marvel to me that they could get something that colossal put together. Well, they did, and we'll talk about what the implications were with regard to that big image, but some people think that was kind of an image that related to one of his chief gods, or it might have been an image that he put together to represent himself, which we don't know, but maybe it was both. But he was, he was. I'm sure he was egocentric. He was full of himself. I'm sure that he was believed that he was the greatest thing that ever happened to this earth. And at this point, when that image was erected, was about the time his generals, his army, erased Jerusalem. Now, so it was just not in that time frame when he was getting rid of Jerusalem, that these things transpired. Now, sometimes kings went to war, and sometimes they didn't. David typically went to war with his troops, but then he weakened, and what did his troops say? You stay at home. We'll take care of this. Well, there was an archaeological find in 1854. That's a long time ago. But there was they found a giant pedestal that some believe, served as a base for this great image. Now, in looking at this, these narratives, it's always a contest between the God of the Jews and the gods of the nations, and particularly with the Babylonians. It was in that first dream that he had, that Nebuchadnezzar had, he had to acknowledge that the God of the Hebrews was superior to his gods. Now, he didn't do anything about it. He didn't act upon that acknowledgement, as we see in chapter 3, because now he's just still full of himself. So, the image was there, and we run on to the fact that there were three, that what we usually referred to as the Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they were targeted. I wonder why they were targeted. You see, Daniel probably saved a lot of their necks, so to speak, when he interpreted the dream, because the order went out to kill them all, kill all the magicians and so forth, the advisors to King Nebuchadnezzar. And during that period of time, and we don't know how many got killed, we don't know if any got killed, but it would seem, as the narrative unravels, it would seem that some of them were saved by virtue of the Daniel being able to interpret the dream. So, but why do you suppose these Chaldeans, these officials, why do you suppose they turned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in? Why do you suppose they ran to the king and said, hey, these people aren't following your orders?
Jealousy, for one.
Pardon me?
Jealousy. They were very jealous.
Yeah.
They figured if they could get Daniel's friends, they had to wait to Daniel.
Kathy says that they were envious, they were jealous and why would they be jealous? Because what happened to Daniel, what did the king do to Daniel, or do for Daniel, when he interpreted the dream? Gave him authority, power. And what did Daniel do with regard to his three friends? We come as a group. You give me power, extra power. Let's give these. So they were powerful people in that kingdom. And now think about this again. This is really something there. These incidents happened at about the same time that Jerusalem was being wiped off the map. God works in mysterious ways, and that's kind of one of the mysteries that I consider a mystery. So Nebuchadnezzar, of course, had a problem with anybody disobeying his his commands. Now, we find that strange. At least I find it strange. If one disobeys, let's say the governor or the president, they're not going to be, chopped up. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar was suggesting that they'd be chopped up, But, there's nobody in this country, theoretically at least, nobody is above the law. And isn't that great as a government philosophy? Nobody, even that it doesn't always work out that way, but at least in theory, in our democracy, nobody is above the law. And so an official can't order the death of somebody that they don't like or they consider disobeying them. And we just ought to be so thankful for the rule of law. But in that era, in that kingdom, there was no rule of law except that the kings were executives, they were legislators, they were judicial people. They were the judiciary, the executive branch, the legislative branch. It was all, and of course our forebears found that was a real problem, and so they separated powers. And I'm just throwing that in as a little extra. You don't have to pay for that this morning. Chapter 3 then, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold. Now, Babylon was filled with gold. They had tons of gold. Why did they have tons of gold? Well, they conquered countries and took all of their possessions. What they do to the Temple of Jerusalem? that temple was had a lot of gold. Well, that of course went to the captors. So they had lots of gold. Now, it was an image of gold plated, or was it? How much gold we don't know, but the height was 80 cubits. Well, how long is a cubit? About 18 inches, most people believe. So there are variations of, some scholars have a different idea there, but most people believe it was 18 inches, so that it was 60 feet high, or 60 cubits high, or 90 feet, and the breadth there was 6, and so that would make it 9 feet across. And he set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. I don't think there's anyone who really knows exactly where that was. I don't know that there was any archaeological findings that really related to that image. You can imagine when Babylon was destroyed, you can imagine something like that. There's gold plated, or gold had, you can imagine there'd be lots of people chipping off the gold. Then in verse 2, then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes. Now, they had, there were, the king obviously had minions, had officers, had people that did various functions with regard to the government of Babylon. So they had some, what they called princes. They had governors, or deputies of some kind. They had captains, they had judges, they had treasurers, plural. They might be tax collectors. We don't know exactly what the functions of each of these officers was. The function, counselors, sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces. Now the provinces under the Medo-Persian, when later on the Medo-Persians had 127 or 129 provinces. I don't remember. I always forget which. But we get that information from the book of Esther. And so they had all kinds of officers. He called them together, and they had a dedication of this image. All of us probably attended some kind of a dedication of a building or some event. But it was a big, you can imagine, just a big, humongous gathering. And they dedicated this image. Now, that might give you some, idea as to who this image was supposed to be. And it may have been Nebuchadnezzar's representation of himself. Okay? Then the princes and the governors and the captains in verse 3, the judges and the treasurers and the counselors and the sheriffs and all the rulers of the province were gathered together unto the dedication of the image. That Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, somebody making a big pronouncement, to you and to it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. Now, I wonder why he says nations and languages. Well, they had conquered a lot of nations that had spoken their own language. Verse 5, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute and the harp, sackbut and psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Now there may be some people that know what kind of musical instruments these were, but I think that would be useless to even know. But it was a big deal. So there'd be lots of people in the orchestra, so to speak. They had all kinds of music. Now this probably took place over maybe 2 or 3 days or a week or whatever. But it was a great gathering and lots of falderall, as we might say. So here was the command: you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall be the same hour cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Now, I don't have any idea what that fiery furnace was. It above ground? Was it below ground? We just don't know. But it was may have been below ground because they were commanded to throw some people into it. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, and all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans, sometimes the Babylonians were, the Babylonians and Chaldeans were that name was interchanged, but I don't know. Does anyone know, was there a difference between Chaldeans and Babylonians? Were the Chaldeans a special kind of officer, a special kind of, or a designated group that had some particular function? I don't know. Does anyone have any clue on that? Ned, maybe you can just Google that and find out and let us know.
See what the internet says.
Pardon me?
I'll see what the internet says.
Okay, just as soon as you find out, interrupt me and we'll give you that information. They spake and said unto the king, now these Chaldeans, probably these were the, those people that advised the king. So, you find it yet, Ned?
Yeah.
Not yet. Okay. Well, we'll go on then. So, in verse 10, thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound that shall hear the sound of the cornet and all those musical instruments shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whosoever faileth not to and whosoever falleth not down and worshipeth thee, that he should be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. I suppose there was some kind of an announcement made that, if you don't worship this thing, then you're going to be tossed in the furnace. This seems to imply that. What do you find there?
It says that basically there are ancient people who lived in Chaldea, and they were ruled by Babylonians, but they were renowned astronomers and astrologers.
So these Chaldeans, if that internet information is right, these Chaldeans were known for their astrology, that has to do with the predicting the future, interpreting dreams and all that stuff. So, then that's good to know if it's accurate. But if it's on the internet, it's probably okay. The what?
They were one of the wisest men.
Wise.
Yeah, so that's probably why they did it, because they were jealous because David was able to interpret the dream and they couldn't.
Yeah. They were known for their wisdom, their being able to predict the future, all that sort of thing. Okay. And then here's the backstabbing. There are certain Jews. Now, they were probably clever and tried to get the king's ire up. There are certain Jews, whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Now, so here, what authority did these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have?
They were over the affairs of the provinces of Babylon.
Yep. Yes. They were in a high position. These men, in verse 12, in the middle of the verse there, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods. Now, just a few months or a few years before this, Nebuchadnezzar sent out an order that nobody better speak against the God of the Hebrews. But I think Nebuchadnezzar had he had forgotten about that because of what's going to happen next here in this narrative. Nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Now, apparently they were to worship the gods as well as this golden image. It was a package deal, apparently. And then you can imagine how clever these guys would have been. You know, King, you know, you're deserving of all this worship. You're deserving of being your commands being obeyed. And here, how dare these Jewish people? How dare them disobey the most powerful king of the known world? So he was in a rage, and he sent for them. Bring them on. I need. But then they were rulers, so he needed to find out, you know, firsthand. He needed to get some further information on this. He needed to interrogate them. Then they brought these men before the king. They brought them. Apparently they were, they had an envoy there. Okay, ushering them into the king. Nebuchadnezzar said and spake and said unto them, "Is it true?" I want to hear it from you guys. Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? What's the matter? We're going to get a confession here, one way or another. They're either going to say, "Yeah, we'll do that," or we won't. Now, where do you suppose Daniel was in this story, in this segment? Pardon me?
I would think he had to be away doing something for them, somewhere in some other province, maybe.
Knowing the character of Daniel, if it had been there, he would have done the same thing as the three Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? I mean, is there any doubt about that? I mean, I don't think there would be any doubt in our minds that Daniel would cave in to these orders, but he might, he might have been away on business miles away. But at least we don't have any information about him. Or maybe these people were afraid to, since Daniel was such a prominent government official, maybe they were afraid, more afraid of him, and then didn't turn him in. I don't know. Anybody have any speculation on that? But these three were pretty convicted in what they believed. Now, if ye be ready, now Nebuchadnezzar values these people, and he said, "Now, I'm going to give you another shot at it. If you just, we'll try this again. Now, if you will be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well." That'll be good. Well, fine. "But if you worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" Now, if in fact this was close to the time when Daniel interpreted the dream, there Nebuchadnezzar is acting very inconsistent. Now, what might have these three men done? What might they have done? They might have said, well, okay, under their breath, say, we don't believe in what we're doing, but we'll do it to just get the king off my back. I mean, what?
Facing death.
Huh?
They were facing death, so
Yeah. Well, I mean, what would be? They didn't believe that. They didn't believe that stuff. So, what would have hurt just to do it and then go back and worship God? What would be the problem with that? Yeah, it's compromise. What would have been the problem if New Testament Christians would have been bowed down to Caesar as a god? We've heard a lot of lessons about that, about the faith that the early church had with regard. They just, some of them probably did, but then we have a record of those that obviously didn't bow down to Caesar and give worship to Caesar. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, do you suppose they acted defiant? Do you suppose they were courteous? Or do you suppose they got all mad and emotional and so on? Probably not. They just said, look, king, you need to understand where we're coming from. If it be so, as they answered Nebuchadnezzar, he said, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. That is, we have no need. We don't have any need to answer. It's just, king, it's this way. If it is to be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Did they know that God would deliver them at that point, do you suppose? Well, then he said, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, if he doesn't, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They probably were very polite, just said, if God delivers us, okay. If he doesn't, we're going to serve God. That was the message there. Well, here's a, Nebuchadnezzar could have remembered about Daniel interpreting his dream. He could have said, well, I appreciate your dedication to your God, and I respect you for that. That he could have had that attitude, but he was arrogant. He was an egomaniac. He became full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He had a different attitude toward them now, and his attitude caused him to be furious. And so he said, okay, have it your way, but I'm going to get this furnace heated up a little hotter. Now that idea of 7 times hotter, I don't know how would you measure 7 times hotter. They didn't have thermometers that would have measured it. That's just an expression of 7 times. It's 7 is often used in the sense of being complete, or the totality. But anyway, heated up. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their garments, and their hats, and their other garments. They were fully, enclosed in garments that would have been combustible, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, in verse 22, therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the people that were commanded to throw them in the furnace, it was so hot that they perished. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a witness to all of this. Then Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He was amazed, probably perplexed. And he rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. And he answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Now, I mean, what notion did Nebuchadnezzar have as to the Son of God? I mean, this 4th person, what was different, right? That's what we know. It was different. This indicates it was different. This 4th one. Now, this is a hard question. Was this an angel? Was it, some people believe it was Christ before he was, took human form and came in the 1st century. Any ideas on that? Any wisdom anybody can shed on that? Maybe it's immaterial, and it probably is. But the bottom line here is that this 4th person was different. And this 4th person didn't come out, right? He didn't come out of the furnace with the 3 of them, which is all we know is some heavenly being. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 26, came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace. He didn't get close enough to get burned. And he spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Come over here. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire. And the princes and the governors and the captains and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power. Not was an hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, their clothing wasn't even changed, nor the smell of fire had passed upon them. It didn't even smell like fire. Now, the king had these people examine these three and say, well, they're flesh. They're still alive. They're not even hair was singed. So they got, they were witnesses to this and examined them, and nothing had happened to them. Then verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Now, here's a guy that was furious with them. Now he's saying, good. I mean, he's acknowledging that their God saved them. He's no longer in a rage, and now he has a different attitude. Therefore, in verse 29, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything against or amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, a ruin, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. So again, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges the efficacy, the greatness of God compared to the gods of the Babylonians. Then the king promoted. Now, isn't this an irony? So the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So, what could he do to promote them? Give them more authority. Now you can imagine those people that brought the three men to Nebuchadnezzar. I imagine they were running like a scalded dog. I think they were probably very much intimidated, and of course we don't know what happened to them, but it just things changed. Things were changing by the minute in terms of who's now going to be in power and so on. So that's I would guess most of the children in this auditorium. And when we get in the auditorium, all of us get in the auditorium together. Most of the children would know about this story, right? But might not know, some of the details and some of the implications of this story, other than teaching that we must have great trust and confidence in God, and to the extent of being harmed as a result of conviction and allegiance to God. Now, in chapter 4, there's going to be another narrative that deals with King Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll pick up there next week, chapter 4.